man regarded as the hero saving the white South from perdition, from the carpetbaggers, some of whom bear an extraordinary resemblance to the present President of the United States of America. Now, and of course they were called carpetbaggers because they were mulatto politicians who arrived in the South, primarily from the North, with certain abolitionist sponsorship, and they arrived with everything they owned in a carpet bag to take over, and that's why they were called that. Now, that film, which you can get in any DVD store and buy off the Amazon, for example, for £10 or so, is extraordinarily notorious, but in actual fact, in terms of its iconography, it's a heroic, dualist film where there's a force of darkness and a force of light, there's a masculine individual, there's people who believe that they sort out problems with the gun, the Bible in an ultra-Protestant way is their text, it's what they base metaphysical objectivism and absolute value upon, and that film is perceived retrospectively as an extreme right-wing film, although Griffiths himself is later to do a film called Intolerance, and actually, like a lot of filmmakers, had quite a diverse range of views, irrespective of his own Southern and Texan background. The thing one has to remember is that the methodology of the heroic can survive, even if people fight against various forces in Western life. One of the great tricks of the heroic in the last 40 to 50 years is that heroic films, involving icons like Clint Eastwood, for example, as a successor to the sort of archetype of John Wayne and the sort of Western stylised masculinity that he represented. Eastwood often plays individualistic, survivalist and authoritarian figures, right-wing existentialist figures. But they're always at war with bureaucracies and values that are perceived as conservative. One of the basic tricks which has occurred since the 1960s is to reorient the nature of the heroic so that the internal radical right within a society, such as the United States or elsewhere, is the enemy, per se. There's a comic strip in the United States called Captain America, which began in the 1940s. Captain America is a weedy young man who almost walks with a stick and has arms like branches. And of course, a friendly American scientist introduces him to a new secret program where he's injected with sort of steroids and this sort of thing, and immediately becomes this enormous, blonde, hulking Superman with blue eyes, and of course he must dress himself in the American flag, so he can call himself Captain America, so you get the idea. And he has a big shield, which has the star of the United States on it, and he has a sidekick, who dies in one of the 1930s or 40s comics, but of course these figures never die, they're endlessly brought back. But there's a problem here, because the position that Captain America and the lesser Marvel Comics equivalent called Captain Britain and all of these other people represent is a little bit suspect in an increasingly liberal society, even then. So his enemy, his nemesis, his dualist alternative has to be a Nazi. And of course, Captain America has a Nazi enemy who's called the Red Skull. And the Red Skull is a man with a hideous face who, to hide this hideousness, wears a hideous mask over his hideous face as a double take, you know? The mirror cracks, so why not wear a mask? But it's not a mask of beauty, but it's a skull that's painted red, and he's called the Red Skull. And he always wears green, so it's red and green. And he always appears, and there's always a swastika somewhere in the background and that sort of thing, and he's always building robots or cyborgs or new biological sort of creatures to take over the world, and Captain America always succeeds in vanquishing him in the last panel, just in the last panel. The Red Skull is always about to triumph until the fist of Captain America for the American way and the American dream comes in at the end. Now, this mantle of the heroic, whereby right-wing existentialists like Captain America fight against the extreme right in accordance with democratic values, is one of the interesting tricks that's played with the nature of the heroic, because the heroic is a dangerous idea. And whether or not Tintin was based on Leon Degrelle, there is a quasi-fascistic element to the nature of the heroic, which many writers of fantasy and science fiction, which began as a despised genre, but is now, because it's so commercially viable, one of the major European bookish genres, have always known this. Michael Moorcock, amongst others, speaks of the danger of subliminal rightism in much fantasy writing, where you can slip into an unknowing, an ultra-right-wing, an uncritical attitude towards the masculine, towards the heroic, towards the vanquishing of forces you don't like, towards self-transcendence, for example. There's a well-known novel called The Iron Dream, And this novel is, in a sense, depicting Hitler's rise to power and everything that occurred in the war that resulted thereafter as a science fiction discourse, as a sort of semiotic by a mad creator. And this book was actually banned in Germany because although it's an extreme satire, which is technically very anti-fascistic, it can be read in a literal-minded way with the satire semi-detached. And this novel by Norman Spinrad was banned for about 20 to 30 years in West Germany, as it then was, because fantasy enables certain people to have an irony bypass. Although comics are quite humorous, particularly to adults, children and adolescents read them, scan them, because they sort of look at the images and sort of just take in the balloons as they go across, because these are films on paper. They essentially scan them in an uncritical way. If you ever look at a child, particularly a child that's got very little interest in formal literature of a sort that's taught in many European and American schools, they sit absorbed before comics, absolutely enthralled by the nature of them, by the absolute villainy of the transgressor, by the total heroicism and absence of irony and sarcasm of the heroic figure, with the scantily clad maiden on the front that the hero always addresses himself to, but usually in a dismissive way, because he's got heroic things to accomplish, but she's always on his arm, or on his leg, or being dragged down. Indeed, the pulp depiction of women, which of course is deeply politically incorrect, and vampish, and this sort of thing, is a source of great amusement in these genres. If you ever look at comics like Conan the Barbarian, or Iron Man, or the Incredible Hulk, and these sorts of things, the hero will always be there, in the middle, never to the side, always in the middle, four square, facing the future. The villain will always be off to one side, often on the left, the side of villainy, you know? The side of the sinister, that which wants to drag down and destroy. And as the Hulk is about to hit the leader, which is his nemesis, or Captain America is about to hit the Red Skull, which is his nemesis, or Batman's about to hit the psychiatric clown called the Joker, who's his nemesis, and so on. There's always a scantily clad woman who's round his leg on the front cover, sort of looking up in a pleading sort of way, as the fist is back here. And it's quite clear that these are archetypal male attitudes of amusement and play, which of course have their danger to many of the assumptions that took over in the 1960s and 70s. It's interesting to notice that in the 1930s, quite a lot of popular culture expressed openly vigilante notions about crime. There was a pulp magazine called The Shadow that Orson Welles played on the radio. And Orson Welles didn't believe in learning the part. At New York radio, Wells, usually the worst for wear for drink and that sort of thing, would steam up to the microphone, he would take the script and just launch into The Shadow straight away. The Shadow used to torment criminals, and the nastier they were, the more he'd torment them. When he used to kill them or garrote them or throttle them or hang them, these pulps were quite violent, and unashamedly so. He used to laugh uproariously like a psychopath. And indeed, if you didn't get the message, there would be lines in the book saying ha 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 for several lines, you know, as he actually did people in. There was Batman in some ways is the prototype, so The Shadow is the prototype for Batman who comes along later. Batman is, as certain Marxian cultural critics in a discourse called Cultural Studies have pointed out, Batman is a man who dresses himself up in leathers to torment criminals at night and looks for them when the police, namely the state, the authority, in a fictional New York called Gotham City, put a big light in the sky saying, come and torment the criminal class. They put this big bat symbol up in the sky and he drives out in the Batmobile looking for villains to torment. As most people are aware, comics morphed into more adult forms in the 1980s and 90s, and a graphic novel emerged called Dark Knight, which explored in quite a sadistic and ferocious way Batman's desire to punish criminality in a very extreme way. There was also a pulp in the 1930s called Doc Savage. Most people have vaguely heard of these things because their Hollywood films have been made on and off about all these characters. Doc Savage was an enormous blonde who was 7 feet, who was bronzed with the sun and covered in rippling muscles. Indeed, to accentuate his musculature, he wore steel bands around his wrists and ankles, as you do. He was a scientist of genius, a poet of genius, a musician of genius. In fact, there's nothing that he wasn't a genius about. He was totally uninterested in women. He also had a research institute that operated on the brains of criminals in order to reform them. This is quite extraordinary and deeply politically incorrect. he would not only defeat the villain